So we're talking about two pretty major apocalyptic things. We're talking about climate change and the apocalypse and the impending doom that it brings, and the world ending for so many Americans and so many people in the globe during the Great Depression. And so the Green New Deal is trying to pull all those things together and then also try to root out some of the racist legacy of the New Deal. The fact that when we think about like domestic workers weren't part of the conversation in the New Deal because most domestic workers were Black and brown folks. The fact that farm workers weren't part of it because most farm workers were immigrants or they were Black people. And so there is that culmination of those two significant federal moments with another layer of how do we advance justice and equity to meet the moment that we're in.
I'm Susan Spurlock, Executive Director of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and I am pleased to welcome you to week 4 of our virtual Spring 2021 series, number 46, examining the first 100 days of the Biden administration, a survey course for all. The lecture series continues with this evening's program, Fixing What's Broken, Climate and Environmental Policy. Christina?
Thanks, Susan. I'm excited to be back, and I'm really, really excited to see everybody in the audience tonight for this, which is, I think, the 4th episode of our spring series that examines the Biden administration and what the promises and challenges are to major policy issue areas in his agenda. So the big topic tonight is climate and environment, and we have an awesome panel to discuss a lot of what may happen or what may not happen. And I'm interested to know how excited they are about the early signs of what Biden is doing with respect to climate. So number one, he has created new positions, right, to address climate both globally and domestically. He has said he's going to infuse climate and environment in all of what his federal administration does. So they sound like promising early steps. The real question is, will he be able to deliver on those promises, and what are the obstacles to that? So without further ado, I want to introduce tonight's panel. We have with us Michel Legendre, who is from Corporate Accountability, Sririam Madhusoodanan, and Rachel Cleetus, who is from the Union of Concerned Scientists. Our moderator tonight is a return guest. For those of you who have followed our series along, we're really excited to have Arjun Singh from the Washington Post moderate tonight's panel. So without further ado, I'm going to toss it to Arjun and look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you, Christina. It is an immense pleasure to be back with everybody here at Suffolk. I had a great time doing this over the summer, and I'm particularly excited about this conversation. As Christina mentioned in the introduction, President Biden was elected on a mandate by many in the Democratic base, and even outside of that, to lead on climate change. That being said, Biden himself, given his history as both vice president and as a senator, has traditionally been an incrementalist, and he has been fearful of using broad executive power to bypass the Congress. What is happening with climate change, however, in some ways seems to have changed the calculus for Biden himself, but at the same time, it leaves many to wonder whether this is the president for the time being to take the actions that we need to take. So I want to open up our conversation tonight by asking each member of our panel to provide a little bit of an assessment of how you were feeling when President Biden entered office, and whether you feel optimistic or concerned that this administration will move fast enough on climate change. So for the first person I'd like to go to, I'd like to hear from you, Rachel. How do you feel about President Biden and his administration so far? And do you feel optimistic that he's going to be able to do what you feel we need to do to move on climate change?
Well, I'm certainly feeling really hopeful. This administration's hit the ground running, and they've said a few things already which show that they understand the gravity of the situation and what it'll take to address it. First thing, they're centering science in all their policy making. They've made it very, very clear. They understand the science. They understand we're living in a climate emergency, climate crisis. Number two, they understand that we're not going to solve this climate crisis in a corner somewhere. It's deeply connected to people's daily lives. This has to be solutions that address the moment we're in, this grave economic crisis, the health crisis, the crisis of systemic racism. So our climate solutions have to have equity and justice built into them. These are signals we're getting very clearly from this administration. Now, of course, in our democratic system, we also need Congress to act if we're going to get durable, robust action. And this is a Congress that has not accomplished very much in the last few years on a bipartisan basis. So are we going to be able to break through that logjam? That's up to all of us, and it's up to the Biden administration and Congress to step up and actually deliver on the mandate that they now have.
Michel, I'd like to hear from you next.
Thanks. Yeah. I think I'm both relieved and a little bit skeptical. I'm relieved that we're no longer fighting the fires of a Trump administration, that we're not trying to protect our communities against consistent and ongoing onslaughts. And I'm skeptical that Biden is the president that we've enlisted for this moment. And a lot is like remaining to be seen. Will Biden step into the wave of momentum of youth organizing, of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizing, of frontline and fence line communities in a moment where global solidarity is at its peak? Or will he fall for the same tried and true federal level response to moments like this by thinking that he can reach across the aisle and act in good faith with opposition that is deeply in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry and big polluters' interest? So I think that the moment that we're in is a tremendous one. And I have hope in the movement and the moment that we're in. And I'm waiting to see if Biden will step up to the plate.
And Sri, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a good question, right? And I think when I think back to where we were before the election, it's really clear that in electing Biden, we are as movements advancing climate change, racial justice, systemic transformation in this country, we've been choosing our organizing landscape for the next 4 years. Now, Biden has said in a number of times that he wants to have an FDR style presidency. And I think if that's the case, then he needs to step in, especially in the first 100 days, into the chance for transformative leadership. And I think that looks like a couple of things. You know, is he willing to make the bold commitments that he campaigned on? Is he willing to really adhere to the science and what frontline communities in the US and globally are calling for, and put the US on a path to a managed decline of fossil fuel production, keeping global warming within the targets of 1.5, because we're already seeing climate impacts day after day. And I think very much for the international community, we're seeing that so far Biden has taken some of the first steps, whether it's canceling the Keystone XL permit or rejoining the Paris Agreement, that arguably could be said are some of the easiest things on that list. The question now is, will Biden put the US on a path to really showing the world that we're serious about leading on this issue? And that means bold emissions cuts at home and supporting the world in a transition that's equitable and just off of fossil fuels.
Rachel, I'd love to start with you because I think this would be very helpful for the students to hear, is that politically climate change is still a divisive topic between the two parties in parts of the nation. But among scientists, could you talk a little bit about the history of studying climate change and when the consensus formed around that the climate is changing, that it is being caused by man, and when that we need to take actions for that? When did the science really come to have a consensus around that? And how long has it taken it for the political movement that you've been involved in to kind of catch up with that science, if you think it has?
The reality is the science on climate change has been clear for over 100 years, the basic underlying physics of climate change. The scientific consensus, if you take the IPCC process as one form of that consensus, has been clear since at least 1995. And way back at the Rio Summit in 1992, when the nations of the world came together and signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the bedrock framework on which everything, including the Paris Agreement, sits. That dates back to the Rio Summit, and then it came into effect in 1994. So we're talking about multiple decades here. We're now at a little over 1 degree Celsius increase in global average temperatures above pre-industrial levels, and we are seeing profound effects all around the world already. These extreme storms, hurricanes in this part of the world, but typhoons and cyclones over in Asia. We've seen heavy rainfall, droughts, extreme wildfires. Just here in the US, we had 22 events last year, extreme climate and weather related events that each cost more than $1 billion. 268 people lost their lives. It's just stunning. Climate change is here and now. And you honestly just have to be a regular person to know it, just reading the headlines, just looking outside. But of course, the scientific consensus has been clear for a long time. The reason that it's been muddied is because fossil fuel interests have obfuscated and spread misinformation deliberately. They've been trying to lie about the science because they see their profits at risk. So they've put their profits ahead of the broader societal good. This is not a moment where we should even waste 1 second debating the science. This is now about solutions and action. And honestly, we shouldn't even be debating the transformative nature of the solutions we need. As Sri and Michel have pointed out, this is a moment for transformative change. We have no more time to lose on incremental action. This is not just about reaching net zero well before 2050, as the IPCC has indicated, but this is about what are we going to do in the next decade. We need to have global emissions by 2030 on the order of halving, according to the IPCC. So as a leading contributor to those emissions, both historically and now on an annual basis, the US really needs to step up. We have to do our part to reduce our emissions quickly, steeply, and we can do it. The solutions are here, we can do it. We just need to have the policies and the political will in place.
And Sri, I'd love to go to you on this. Do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that I agree wholeheartedly with what Rachel has brought forward. And I think I'd just like to underscore that, some of the first climate science that was done internally by these very fossil fuel corporations, right? Like Exxon knew, Shell and others have known for decades. And I think when we're in this moment where the science and the impacts are really underscoring that the need for transformative change is upon us, and now is the moment, not for half steps, but for bold, visionary change. We have to remember that when we do see, for example, just the incredible and insane at times questioning of Deb Haaland during the confirmation hearings for Secretary of the Interior, that there is one party that has been beholden to fossil fuel interests and has been a major part of the reason that there has been such a massive obstacle towards the kind of transformative climate change that we really need. So I think that's an important reminder of where we've come from and why, even though Exxon and Shell did some of the first climate science, for decades, we've seen such a gridlock in Washington and state capitals as well.
And Sri, I'd love to continue on that idea of how the fossil fuel companies and the industry itself has influenced the politics of this moment. I think we hear a lot that special interest groups are there. They have this influence. Some politicians are catering to them. What is the strategy there? What exactly are they doing in terms of pushing their agenda? Is it publishing documents? Is it donating to campaigns? How has the fossil fuel industry been able to have such an outsized influence on this topic?
That is a great question, and almost too much to fit into just the next hour. We could spend ages on that. I think that there's a few really good documentaries, and particularly the pioneering work by Naomi Oreskes on this at Harvard is really seminal in this. I think that a couple of the pieces to keep in mind in terms of the power of the fossil fuel industry has been through one, direct contributions to lawmaking lawmakers to policy campaigns and to both Democratic and Republican lawmakers. So they play both sides of the aisle. When it's not coming through themselves, it also comes through trade associations, which swarm Capitol Hill, which swarm state capitals. And we also see at the highest level of negotiations at the UNFCCC, the UN Climate Treaty, as well at many of the COPs you attend there. And Rachel, Michel, and I can all attest to this personally. It feels like you're almost walking into a trade show versus global negotiations about how we're going to respond to a critical human rights and social justice issue. I think the second piece of it is through really muddying and misleading the public, right? We've seen that for decades, these corporations have mounted an all-out publicity campaign employing some of the same PR firms that were used by the tobacco industry to mislead about the harmful effects of smoking, to really run an all-out offense and in short, sow doubt that climate change was really real. I think, as Rachel pointed out, the science has been very, very clear on it, and it's been a handful of, I doubt to even call them scientists, but really folks who are in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry that have sown this doubt. And I think that's why we're seeing a global movement that is now really working to hold the fossil fuel industry liable for its decades of peddling misinformation and directly contributing to and fueling the climate crisis that we see today.
And Michel, did you have something to add on that point?
Yeah, as the campaign director on our tobacco campaign, I feel like it's really important to like note historically where these tactics are coming from, right? Like this is not a new thing. These are like old tricks being recycled for a new industry. It's happened from the inception of the fossil fuel industry in the late 20th century and into the 21st century. And I think even UCS has like a lot of role to play in terms of connecting the big tobacco playbook to the big oil playbook, right? There's, overlapping lawyers, there's overlapping PR firms, there's, the same tried and true tactics being put on full display. And just to say it really clearly, you have promoting junk science. There's a lot of research papers that early on kind of diluted the notion of what was climate change and what was the real action that was needed. There's CSR, which is corporate social responsibility. So tactics that co-opt and like basically try to greenwash the fossil fuel industry's activities. And you have things like, litigation, just tying up governments in their actions on climate change, saying in one end that they're like totally here for climate action, and then on the other end suing governments that are implementing common sense climate policy. And they implement this stuff using a whole network of sowers of doubt and misinformation machines, from front groups to lobbying efforts to grass top organizations. We've seen it all, and it all stems from this big tobacco playbook that really wrote the corporate tactics for this moment. So I think that there's definitely an interchange of tactics there.
Michel, I want to stay with you because we've talked about the opposition to it, but clearly there was a big movement that pushed on Biden to go about and do these policies. As my coworker Dave Weigel once put it, he didn't just wake up one morning and all of a sudden decide he needed to be bolder. A large part of that were youth movements, groups like the Sunrise movement. And can you talk a little bit about what is it that these youth movements did differently? Why did it strike such a powerful chord in this election? And how are the youth movements viewing climate change in terms of a policy? Is it looking at it as just the science, or have they been able to craft a message that has spread out to an entire generation? Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on behind the scenes there?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is intergenerational movements. I think that we can't talk about climate justice organizing without talking about the civil rights organizing of yesterday, right? And the ongoing civil rights organizing. So there's a lot of components of nonviolent, peaceful protesting and galvanizing public support by putting the people that are most impacted and stand to lose the most out at the front of this debate. And so what you're seeing is you're seeing young people step into their power. You're seeing 8-year-olds go up and talk to a senator in their office and say, we want a livable future. You're seeing Black and brown and indigenous communities saying that not in my community. And it's not just the NIMBY, like not in my backyard, like argument. It's like not anywhere. We won't allow fossil fuel extraction anywhere in the world because we need to stop it right now. Injustice anywhere is injustice for us all, and we can't be free if there's people that are under an oppressive system and structure. And so youth movements really galvanizing around this moment to secure people-centered policy that really shirks this idea that everything has to be market-centered, or that everything has to be about the economics of it. There's economics of humanity. There's economics of human rights. There's economics of finding home in chaos. And I think that this interconnected and intergenerational movement is really doing something that I don't think any of us thought we were equipped to do: connecting migration issues to climate change, connecting homelessness and house insecurity to a minimum wage movement. Fighting for so many different things and so many different categories, while all saying at the same time, we're still here about that climate justice. And I think that is kind of the beautiful and inspiring moment we're in. And the last point that I just want to make is that, a lot of the executive orders that Biden pushed through would have been great 10 years ago, but it's not what this moment calls for. It's a great start, but let's not forget that we were on the precipice of this 5 years ago. If federal lawmakers, if Congress had listened to people-powered movements 5 years ago, but they didn't, and they lost. And so I think that that's like kind of where we're in. We're in a continuation of this long and journeyed struggle for a world that works for people.
And on that sort of same note, President Biden re-entered the Paris Agreement. This big sort of display of his presidency as an administration. But Rachel, I'd love to go to you first to help better understand what exactly is the significance, if there is any, to entering this agreement. I mean, what does this agreement really do in terms of combating climate change? And can you talk a little bit about the global challenge that is facing us? We talk about a lot domestically in our own politics, but what is the global challenge of climate change that's facing humanity as a whole?
The thing about climate change is that it has always been a problem that needs to be addressed on a global scale with global cooperation. This is not about one-upmanship. This is not about competing with each other. We all need to be all in. The other piece that's been very clear from the beginning is it's always been a challenge about justice and equity. The remaining carbon budget left in the world is fast diminishing. It has been by far consumed the most by developed nations, and even within those nations by the rich and the elite in those nations. Meanwhile, the people who, as Michel was saying, are on the front lines of the impacts, both of climate change and the impacts of fossil fuel pollution, tend to be people of color, low-income folks. So the people who have contributed the least to the problem are now facing the brunt of its worst impacts. And this is the fundamental injustice of climate change, of this pollution crisis from fossil fuels. So when we think about our solutions, we can't abstract away these realities. We have to understand, how did we get here? And then make sure that our solutions are not just repeating the patterns of the past, but really having us break through to a new system where we have, we're addressing these multiple problems at the same time, where we're creating fairer systems. What I do think we need to recognize is this youth movement is a global movement. And it's because we have a generation now that's saying, how could you do this to us? How could you put our future in such jeopardy? I have two of these teenagers in my own house. They are climate activists, not by choice, but because this is what we have thrust them into. They understand and are alive to this moment. And it does recall those moments in history when we had these post-colonial movements, these civil rights struggles that were really global struggles about understanding what power, what injustice had done to come together in this confluence to really create so much misery. in the world. And the moment we're in here is to come out on the other side with cleaner forms of energy, yes, but also a system that actually puts people at its center, puts ecosystems at the center and their health at the center of the kind of future we're going to have. And to people who find this sort of scary and out of tune with the life they're in, it's really worth asking yourself, is the status quo working for you? If you're not in among the elite, you're probably worried about your health insurance, worried about how you're going to pay your mortgage, worried about losing your power if you're in Texas, and when is it going to come back? So we are in this moment where the current system is not working. So we can try to fix the system and make sure that we're addressing the climate crisis, but also creating a fairer and more just system at the same time.
And Michel, I want to go back to you because another thing we hear a lot is the Green New Deal. Would you speak a little bit to what is the underlying philosophy behind the Green New Deal?
Yeah, so I think it's really tied to a couple things. One is the most recent green jobs movement that happened in 2008, 2009, where it was this massive federal movement on the cusp of the new Obama administration, saying that we could finally, in the Obama administration, find the roots and the seeds of a revolutionary approach to climate change. And this like all culminated. You had Van Jones down at the Capitol. You had Power Shift, which was Power Shift Network, which at the time was Energy Action Coalition, bringing thousands of young people down to the Capitol and demanding green jobs. Right? It was this moment where there was like this just transition kind of culmination, and so that's like one place where I think a lot of that branched out from, right, is like, how do we center the people that are going to be impacted from a transition away from fossil fuels, and the people that are going to be impacted, which are young people and people that are working in the fossil fuel industry. The other thing that it's taking its history from is from the New Deal, the FDR era, wave of about 36 different acts that implemented many economic and social measures that would help the American people recover from the Great Depression. So we're talking about two pretty major apocalyptic things. We're talking about climate change and the apocalypse and the impending doom that it brings, and the world ending for so many Americans and so many people in the globe during the Great Depression. And so the Green New Deal is trying to pull all those things together and then also try to root out some of the racist legacy of the New Deal. The fact that when we think about like domestic workers weren't part of the conversation in the New Deal because most domestic workers were Black and brown folks. The fact that farm workers weren't part of it because most farm workers were immigrants or they were Black people. And so there is that culmination of those two significant federal moments with another layer of how do we advance justice and equity to meet the moment that we're in and not leave behind the indigenous, Black and people of color voices and lives in this new Green New Deal.
So there's a lot to unpack within that, and I think we can be able to get to all of that. But I think let's start with one component, which is the jobs aspect. And President Biden has proudly described himself as a union president. He even nominated our very own Mayor Marty Walsh, who's himself a former union representative, to be in the Department of Labor, signaling that he is very pro-labor union. Yet some labor unions have voiced a concern that part of this Green Jobs Initiative, those jobs aren't going to materialize enough, or they won't be able to compensate for the level of equity they were getting in their previous union arrangement. Sri, could you talk a little bit about this sort of not feud, but disagreement in some ways between moving forward on green initiatives and unions who are worried about moving too fast on that?
Yeah, and happy to speak to that. And actually, first, if I can, what Michel was just saying reminded me that actually 10 years ago, I was one of those young people in DC who was brought there by Energy Action Coalition and the Power Shift Network. And so I remember very, very much. And actually, just one thing that which leans into my response to this, right, is that I remember the keynote when Van Jones was speaking to 10,000 young people in the Washington Convention Center. And he, as part of his speech, asked us and put to us as a generation, we have the choice of whether we're going to be a generation of locusts or a generation of bumblebees. And that's something that has just stayed with me because, in the past 10 years, what I've seen is that in order to enact those kinds of systemic transformations, we really need policy at the federal and state level that drives that. So, I think this has been a tension that's there, but it's interesting because working at the international level, this conflict around a perceived just transition between the, kind of predominant traditional unions and the environmental movement, or at times like what's kind of a false dichotomy of jobs versus the environment, is also a pretty US centric thing. I think actually globally trade unions are unified, especially if you look at some of the places, whether in the African continent or Latin America, where these unions are connected, and also seeing some of the most exploitative extraction of fossil fuels. Really, trade unions globally are united in demanding a just transition. And even here in the US, there's incredible groups like the Labor Network for Sustainability, which is working to advance the principles of a just transition within the labor movement. I think really what we see now, and what I would kind of think is a moment for really Biden seizing leadership and his own union background, or really working class background from Scranton, Pennsylvania, is really appealing to and encouraging the folks who are here, who are concerned in terms of union jobs or otherwise, to really think about the possibility of what we can enact if we really have a system-wide transformation, if we also really get very clear on what the science says and what it doesn't. There's incredible research from Oil Change International that makes clear that even just with already fossil fuel resources that are under development, if we burn all of that right now, current oil fields, we're blowing past 1.5. And we already know we're, a little over 1 degree temperature rise. We're already seeing the kinds of climate impacts that are coming with that. So really, I think we're at a moment where we know that we need to make deep transformative changes to our economy, to our reliance on fossil fuels by the end of this decade. And that means action in the next year, next 2 years, in order to put us on that track.
And Rachel, I'd love to bring you in on this. What do you make of this disagreement sometimes with some of the unions?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is I think for a while, the climate movement, we should own our faults. We did not fully acknowledge the harsh impact in some communities from this transition away from fossil fuels. Communities in Appalachia, for example, where even without robust climate policy, coal is on the retreat. In the US, it's a historic retreat away from coal to other energy resources, and it is decimating communities. And this is not new, actually. Communities in Appalachia have been mistreated for the entire time that coal has been exploited in these communities. They were always, richer people making money off, and this is a very dangerous job, coal mining. But the reality is that we need to front load that just transition money. It's not enough to tell people the money will come, don't worry, we'll get there. The jobs are being lost now. People are in distress now. And so I think it's very important that if you care about climate change, if you care about solving this problem, that you must care deeply about a just transition. And that is really gathering strength now around the world. You have conversations in Europe, you have conversations even in China. The IEA is just launching a big just transition platform. So I think this is job number one, because jobs are already being lost in these communities. But I think going forward, we also have to understand that this is a classic tactic of an economic system that tries to pit people against each other who are actually in the non-elite, the lower rungs of the economic system. So this false dichotomy, as Sri was talking about, we're in a period of historic income inequality in the US. We have been losing jobs. We have not been investing in creating new jobs. We haven't been investing in education. We haven't been investing in worker training across the board. So yes, as we move away from fossil fuels, some of these challenges will get exacerbated, but let's just remember this is over and above the fact that as a nation, we have not invested in communities. We haven't invested in jobs. We haven't invested in training. So let's do those things. Let's make sure that we're creating the jobs that will be here and be durable for the next century and beyond. Let's not trap communities and people into the jobs of the last decade. And let's honor the people who've kept the lights on for decades too. There is a reason that communities have such a strong identity that's attached to what they have been able to do to this for this country. They have helped power our economy for decades with that coal, with that oil. Let's honor that. That is not when we talk about companies and the misinformation and the bad political actions that they have taken. That's not about the workers. So let's have that really nuanced conversation. Let's make sure we're really supporting the workers as we make this transition. And let's understand that here in the US, this is part of a broader divide we're starting to see because we have underinvested also in rural areas. There's not a good healthcare access, there's not good broadband access. These are all things that leave communities trapped in a situation where they don't have economic opportunities. So again, the reason we need these intersectional solutions is that they are all connected to improving people's lives, even as we solve the climate crisis.
And Michel, I'd love to jump in with you as well, because my understanding is you have some firsthand experience talking to some who work in the oil and gas industry about that. Can you tell us a little bit about what those conversations are like as it regards climate change?
Yeah, I think, I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago. A lot of my family is in the oil and gas industry. And, I think that when we talk about a just transition, we're also talking about the erosion of social safety nets that have been driven by this neoliberal mechanism that's trying to funnel as much profit up to the top. And what's happened is that there's been a shrinking economy for workers, and there's been a theft away from, in Trinidad, for instance, the state-owned oil and gas industry was completely disbanded. None of the workers got a heads up. They received their pension and they were retired. So my uncle got retired at about 50 years old with no idea of like what to do with the next 10 years because he had planned on something different. And then they established a private run with the same heads from the state run department into a new private oil corporation. And the money is now going to the UK because there's a huge British connection to that oil company. So from a personal place, I have seen how there is a real lack of consideration for what's happening to people that are working in the oil fields. They're working on offshore platforms, and there's this highly dependent, almost linear kind of relationship between people that are extracting oil from the ground and the recycling of the extractive types of indentured servitude and slavery that gives people no option about where to go next. In the University of the West Indies, the only specialization of engineering is petroleum engineering. So we've created economies, we've created cultures, we've socialized people to think that there's only one way to operate. And if you don't contribute in that way, then you're not contributing in your community. And so we have to really disband this idea. We have to release the control that these oil and gas and fossil fuel industry more broadly have over communities. And we have to diversify the portfolio of options that people growing up know that they can go into different fields, that they can dream in different ways, that they can realize having a family without worrying about where their next buck is going to come from. And so that's one place that I've definitely seen it. And I've also seen it that we don't talk enough about the cost of these types of jobs on the communities themselves. Oil and gas is happening in Ogoni lands, but I don't think anyone in Ogoni is really appreciating the cost of not having fish that are alive, that are appreciating the decades of inaccessible land use that they're going to have, or that people in Appalachia are going to appreciate the complete mountaintop removal of coal. They're not going to appreciate that filtering into their water, and these people don't appreciate that. And so this dichotomy gets created because it's a divide and conquer tactic, and it's really on us as environmentalists, it's on us as organizers to bridge that gap, which I think that Rachel's right, is that there's not a history of us doing that. And for folks that are growing up in that, we often see it as like an almost an enemy in disguise, right? So I think we need to get away from that.
We have just a couple more minutes before we get over to our student questions, but One thing I'd love to hear a little bit about, if you can, Rachel, is I know you have a colleague over at the Union of Concerned Scientists who's been involved with the coal communities in Appalachia. Can you talk a little bit about their work and some of the insights that they have learned from that?
Yeah, I hate to speak on behalf of, but my colleague Jeremy Richardson comes from a family of coal miners, grew up in West Virginia, and is doing some really incredible work in partnership with community groups. I just dropped a link in the chat around this National Economic Transition proposal, and it's really encouraging to see that the Biden administration has set up at the White House level an interagency task force on coal communities. Now we need to see that actually get some resources and actually engage with stakeholders on the ground to figure out what that vision of the future is. You know, on a personal level, when I first came to the United States, I came to West Virginia. I studied at West Virginia University. I got married there. I actually, you know, feel a deep personal connection as well myself. And I think this is the thing, people and places matter. This is not about abstract things like emissions in the atmosphere alone. This is really about people who are living in places who really need to see themselves in this climate safe future, this clean energy future. And that's that vision that we can all own and all feel a part of. That's what building this big diverse movement is about. And I really have so much respect for people who are trying to bridge, trying to come to a space of understanding, to a space of knowing that these are not trade-offs. We can have jobs and environmental justice and solve the climate crisis. These shouldn't be trade-offs. But I think that the politics won't align until we actually have the solutions coming from the people and bridge these differences ourselves. Politicians tend to lead from behind. They are worried, and this is not just a partisan issue. This is true for coal state Democrats. It's not just a Republican and Democrat thing. We have to find ways to bridge these gaps. We have to show people that there's real opportunities here. And then I think the politics and the politicians will follow. That's the sad truth. That's what we've seen in the past, that they will act only when they feel like their feet are being held to the fire and that they have no other choice but to act. And that's the kind of moment we're in.
And with that, I'd love to move over to our students now for this section, but I also want to remind the audience that now is your opportunity to go ahead and ask a question yourself. If there's anything you feel like we didn't address or is just a burning question you have, please throw it in the question and answer box that should be at the bottom of your screen. We won't be able to get to every single question, but I will try and make a best effort to get to all of them. And so once again, that's in the question and answer portion. We will review your questions. We'll try and get to as many of them as possible. But let me start off by introducing our first student questioner. Kevin Luna Torres is a junior at Suffolk studying political science with a concentration in international relations. Kevin, welcome.
Thanks, Arjun. My question is for Rachel Cleetus. The use of carbon energy is a norm for most Americans, and many people believe that renewable energy is expensive. Given this, how do you think the Biden administration could not only necessarily change minds, but bring Americans along so they are on board to help him deliver on his ambitious plans of zero net emissions by 2050?
Yeah, I guess what's really helpful is to start with some facts here, because here in the United States, we're at about 20% renewable energy, 40% clean energy, about 40% of carbon-free energy as a whole. And we have seen an extraordinary growth in the last 10 years, literally double-digit cost declines in wind, solar, battery storage over the last 10 years. And we are now in a situation where, in fact, last year renewables outpaced coal in terms of how much power they were producing in the US. So this is a moment where we have to, first of all, people don't think, they just turn on their light switches and they don't know where the power is coming from. And that actually isn't serving us well in this moment. We have to actually be explicit. Where is your power coming from? Be curious about it. And as a consumer, you need to be advocating to your utility company that they invest in more renewable power. But those spaces have remained very close to public engagement. They're very wonky. And what organizations like ours at UCS are trying to do is really advocate in those spaces where utilities are making decisions about their long-term investment plans, that they align those plans with our climate goals, make sure that they're investing not just in renewable energy, but the transmission and the storage that we'll need to really ramp up renewable energy. So I would encourage people, first of all, please do look at your local utility and be curious about where your power is coming from. Ask why more of it is not renewable. And understand that when you look around the country, this is actually the most bipartisan aspect. There are lots of red states and lots of blue states that are doing so well in terms of renewable energy right now. And it's because it's cheap. It just makes sense. It is around the world one of the cheapest forms of energy now to install. New power coming from renewables is cheaper than fossil fuels in most places in the world. So let's just seize on this moment to double down on the momentum already underway. Number two, I would say, think about transportation. It is now the leading source of emissions here in the US, and we need to be thinking holistically about this, not just about individual passenger vehicles, which we do need to electrify, but really think about mass transit, how we're developing our cities so that we can have more walkable cities that are healthier, waste less time in traffic and those kinds of things, and really push corporations to be part of the solution, not sit on the sidelines, but just jump in, be part of the solution. You can produce these low carbon energy technologies. You know, last week when we saw the Mars rover Perseverance land, it was a moment of such joy, you know, all of us watching this amazing thing happen. And when you think that we can do that, we can make those long-term goals and deliver, why can't we do that right here on Earth? So I would say to you, the first thing you should challenge is that this question that we can't do it. We have the solutions. It's just that what we have standing in the way is the politics.
And Sri, did you have a point you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, you know, I think just kind of, and Rachel laid out so powerfully the economics of this, but I think building on our previous conversation, I think one takeaway for all of us, and this is just for me especially, is that there are jobs in the transition off of fossil fuels, and it's our job right now to ensure that those are good paying union jobs, that those are jobs that center the dignity of folks who are working in the industry. Just yesterday, I was listening to a press conference by Richmond communities, which have seen massive amount of oil from a burst pipeline at a Chevron refinery there. And folks in the community and on the city council were calling for an end to the refinery and a decommissioning of the refinery, because they know that there's going to need to be work to remediate that site, to decommission it, and to transition off of fossil fuels. And also, one of the core points that was made is that, you know, we know that at some point Chevron may leave anyway. This is about centering a just transition that really is about people and putting the community first. So I think that's a really important thing for us to hold as we think about, in this moment, how do we really push, agitate, and demand a just transition.
Great. Thank you, Kevin, for your question. Next, I'd like to introduce Matt McKenna. He's a graduate student here at Suffolk studying applied politics. Matt, welcome.
Thanks, Arjun. I want to start by saying thank you to all the panelists for taking the time to speak with us today. My question is for Sririam. The Biden administration has promised dramatic action on climate. How important are the US actions in regards to the global approach to climate change? Is there any way to create bipartisanship on this issue? And are there other countries the US should look towards when crafting and implementing these policies?
Yeah, this is such a good question, and thank you, Matt, for asking it. You know, I think that in this moment right now, we're looking at the US re-entering international climate negotiation process that for the last 4 years has been sabotaged at almost every opportunity by the Trump administration. And, you know, we can even go further back than that and acknowledge that the Paris Agreement, as it stands, is not yet what we need to get to 1.5. So I think that this moment of opportunity, and over the next few months, especially leading up to COP26, are a critical moment for countries to lay out the plans that will get us to 1.5. I will say that from our perspective, in terms of a lot of what we're seeing from countries and corporations around net zero by 2050, there's a lot of questions that we have there. And I think from a frontline perspective, from a climate justice perspective, if we are going to plan to get to net zero by 2050, but not really have a plan for how we're getting there, or if it's overwhelmingly reliant on offsets or, kind of almost, we released a report with a number of allies today called Carbon Unicorns, because I think one of our deep concerns with allies globally is that this is really just creating a path for the perpetuation of the fossil fuel economy. And we're already seeing that when we look at some of the pledges from corporations like Chevron, like Shell, like BP, that if you look at some of the analysis that's been done, doesn't really align with a 1.5 scenario. So, I think there's a couple of things, as you can see from this analysis by Oil Change International, almost all of it is red in terms of grossly insufficient when looking at these corporations' pledges. So I think we shouldn't forget that, when we're seeing these kinds of pledges come off, usually they are greenwashing and PR schemes, and it's by no means unintentional, given that these are some of the same corporations that are seeing litigation against them as well because of their role in fueling the climate crisis. But I think to the question of bipartisanship, I think, again, this comes to how Biden, in his position as the chief executive, chooses to really put ourselves on a full kind of wartime footing or mobilization to really use the full power of the government to lay out what it is that the US needs to do to keep fossil fuels in the ground, to meet the goals of 1.5. And also at a global level, what this means is deep, bold emission cuts at home, including supporting, listening to calls from frontline organizations that are calling not just for Keystone XL or celebrating Keystone XL permit being denied, but also calling for similar ones for Dakota Access Pipeline or Line 3 for the Biden administration to take critical action there, but also for the US to ensure that it's doing its fair share to support climate action globally, ensuring that countries around the world that, as Rachel acknowledged, this is a deep climate justice issue, are facing the impacts of climate change, are also supported in a transition for their economies off of fossil fuels.
Thank you very much, Matt. Now I'd like to turn to Leslie Van Berkum. She's a graduate student here at Suffolk studying ethics and public policy. Leslie, welcome.
Thanks, Arjun. I think I speak for every student attending this webinar. We really appreciate you all sharing your wisdom on this crucial topic. And my question is for Michel. Michel, when I was growing up in the 60s, tobacco use was ingrained in our culture. But over the past few decades, the change in this paradigm has been remarkable. My question, are there lessons from this trajectory we could adapt in combating other elements that are harmful to our health, such as e-cigarettes, or even to the health of our planet? Some of these harmful elements are under-discussed. Others, as you have often said, are cleverly disguised by their producers or makers. Thanks.
Leslie, I am so happy that you asked a tobacco-related question. This is what I live for. I think there's so many lessons learned, right? Like, first, to start off, that there's been a huge and immense public climate shift. I know that there's probably people on this call, there's a stark transition from people going to restaurants and being offered smoking and non-smoking areas. And I'm hoping that at some point there's a transition where people don't even think about fossil fuels in their day-to-day life. They don't go to a gas station, right? There are those transitions that can be happening. And to actually talk about the precedents of the tobacco control movement, I do need to talk about a treaty, which sometimes is like really heady and boring, but there's a gold standard precedent-setting treaty that marries public health measures and corporate accountability measures called the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And one of the amazing things in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is that it prioritizes public health over vested and commercial interests, which is, you will not hear that in any other treaty, where the prime thing that it's trying to solve is actually above all else. And any party or government that signed up for this treaty has to follow in line with that. And I think the other really important thing is that there's a distinction between corporate accountability measures and public health measures. Public health measures touch people's lives. I think it's the things that people see in their everyday. It's the taxes on cigarettes going up. It's the price changes. It's the plain packaging or the graphic health warnings that deter people from consuming, right? Those are important measures. I think we're seeing some of that on the climate side. On the corporate accountability side, it's things that hold the businesses that are completely responsible and liable for their business activities from seed to cigarette accountable for how they're operating. And there's things like stopping voluntary regulations where they offer how they're going to transition. I think we need to cut that out with the corporations. We need to demand, we need to mandate, we need to regulate these industries to what we need them to fit. There's revolving door references, transparency measures. There's all these things that are guidelines for how do we protect the policy making space. And there's also things about stopping the sponsorship and marketing. There's things on liability measures. So basically, parties taking the tobacco corporations to the point of lawsuits and recouping healthcare costs for how they've operated in country. And I think some of these same things can be reclaimed and are happening in pockets all around the world. We're seeing lawsuits against the fossil fuel industry in cities, in counties, in states that are investigating how much they knew and hoping to like hold them accountable to the transition that we're talking about. And I think that the last thing that I just want to talk about is if we reframed it as what is the reparations that our communities deserve for the lies and deceit of these corporations, we would be having a vastly different conversation. It wouldn't be coal workers versus young people. It wouldn't be bus workers versus, you know, like like legislators. It would be about us all coming together and being like, oh, the common enemy here has been and always will be the fossil fuel industry trying to perpetuate the fossil fuel industry. And it's on us to not perpetuate the cycles that the fossil fuel industry has ingrained in our society. The cycles of harm, the cycles of violations of treaty, the cycles of harming Black and Brown communities. I think that there's so much to be learned from the tobacco control movement, but I think there's even more to be learned from the movements more broadly that have laid out how do you take power to task and how do you demand of power what it must, you know, concede. And I think that Frederick Douglass frames it really well. When we're talking about the abolition of slavery, we're talking about abolishing the fossil fuel industry. Power concedes nothing without demands. And I haven't heard enough from federal regulators about what demands they have of the industry. They talk a lot about what they're going to do, but they haven't demanded a thing. And it's always on young people, and it's always on people that are the most impacted to demand time and time again. And that is exhausting. How many generations of indigenous people are going to demand that their communities stop being polluted and that they get payment for the damage and harm in their communities? And I do want to mention one last thing because I got to stop myself at this point. The Eversource substation is happening in our backyard. It's under the guise of supplying more electrical energy into Eastern Massachusetts, and the folks that have rammed that undemocratic process through have used a fossil fuel transition as one of their main tenets for employing it. But the problem that they've recycled is that they're putting it next to millions of gallons of jet fuel. It's right next to a playground for the community, and it's on the flood zone of the Chelsea Riverbank. What is just about that? Where are the people in the community that are going and cleaning up all of the downtown office buildings in the middle of a pandemic that got their bus lines cut down to one bus line servicing the entire city of Chelsea? Where's the justice for those people? And so I think that when I when I imagine what that looks like in terms of lessons learned, I think that the tobacco industry definitely gives us a precedent of how our entire culture and society needs to shift in order to address that. And we're in the moment right now where the tobacco industry is also laying, how do you normalize the industry again after becoming the pariah? And we need to learn the lessons from that in order to understand how is the fossil fuel industry going to try to deflect its way away from being the pariah of the world and normalize itself in the future and seeding itself as a solution to the very crisis that it's built. So I'm just going to stop.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for your question, and thank you to all of our students who came up and asked a question today. We have a little bit of time, and we won't be able to get to every question that's been asked, but I'm going to try to get to as many of them as possible. But I want to start with this one, and I want to open it up to all three of you, because I think it is something that encapsulates a lot of what we have talked of. Just as Americans refuse to wear masks during the ongoing pandemic, some refuse to acknowledge climate change, and I will also add some refuse to change their lifestyles. What can we do to convince more people to cooperate? Rachel, I'll start with you.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that let's just remember some basic human understanding, which is that it really matters who's talking to you. The same message and the same messenger is not going to come through for everybody. With this COVID-19 pandemic, it's been really important that we have multiple ways of getting information to people through folks they trust in their community, but also at the national level, and have it all echoing each other. Under the previous administration, we had lies and mistruths from the top, from the most loud level of our government, which was hugely harmful, and a big reason why the toll is much higher than it should have been. The toll should have been zero, but I mean, the incredible, we've just passed this 500,000 mark, lives lost. It needn't have been this way. So when it comes to climate change, I think we really have to understand that. You're obviously hearing from all of us who are clearly in the activated phase of thinking about climate change, and it motivates our whole worldview. There are a lot of other people who are just trying to put food on the table. They're worried about getting their kids to school. They're worried about their next paycheck. So it's not fair to say that, well, you really need to be right here and do this thing in this corner. It's more important for them to understand, so how does this connect with something they care about in their daily lives? Are they seeing increasing flooding, increasing extreme weather that's causing damage to crops, to their homes? Are they worried about their kids and health impacts on their kids? Who is it that they trust? It could be someone in their church. It could be a community organizer who's organizing around something that's not climate, but they have a conversation about how climate is connected to health or connected to jobs. So I would say this is not a one-size-fits-all conversation. Like any other very consequential conversation, we have to approach this understanding that people have different entry points. The thing about climate change, it touches everything. If you care about the economy, if you care about health, if you care about your children, if you care about the environment, if you care about your business supply chain, if you care about innovation, whoever you are, if you're in the military and you care about national security and military readiness, climate change is here and it's coming for you and something you care about. So find your entry point, find those trusted folks in those spaces, and let's get this message out in as many ways as we can. There are lots of different solutions, lots of ways people can contribute. There's no one size fits all, and let's all become part of the solution.
Shreek, what about you?
I think in response to this question, where my mind really went was climate change and climate policy. It really transcends individual choices, right? This is about policy at a countrywide and systemic level that can really transform our economies away from fossil fuels. And I think that we do see that we shouldn't underestimate the power that those in elected office, certainly at the national level, can have when they listen to science, when they're rooted in what justice is demanding, and when they really engage in an all-out campaign to educate, to reach everyone, and to convince people to change. I think that there is such a massive way that we can transform our lives. And at the end of the day, we really do see that the policy is both instrumental, and at the same time that it doesn't, just because a few people are questioning the science or aren't wearing masks, doesn't mean that the vast majority of us aren't seeing that climate change is real, that it's accelerating, and that we're demanding that we need to transform rapidly away from fossil fuels in ways that are just. I mean, this is really what the movements that elected Biden called on him to do, and what they'll be tracking to see if he follows through with that in the rest of this period of the first 100 days.
Michel, do you have anything to add to that point?
Yeah, I would just add that I think that for people to change, they need to see material circumstances of their life change. And I think that we've too often talked about climate change as this thing that has to do with climate policy. And I honestly feel, as someone who's an immigrant, as someone who was raised in a low income household, as someone who was raised as a first generation college student, that when I felt the most democratically involved were the moments where either my life was on the line or I felt like my life was going to change. And the fact that we've rolled back safety nets for people that are living day to day, the fact that we're shutting off water and electricity in the midst of a pandemic shows the moral values of this government and the people that are elected to make decisions for our lives. And so I think that if people are going to get involved and want to be part of the change, they have to understand and see that when they make decisions about their life, they get rewarded. And it's not just more of the same. And so, people in Texas need to know that if they, vote in someone who's a Democrat in power, for instance, as a president, that when push comes to shove, it's not just a hands-off approach because there's a Republican stronghold, right? I think that we need to understand that politics shouldn't be a limiting factor in who we reach out to and when we show up for them. Just because it's not politically pragmatic to campaign and support Southern movements doesn't mean that Southern movements aren't going to be the shifting tide for the political endgame. And so I guess just all of that is to bridge together this notion that somehow politics, people's lives, and the shifts in policies don't actually matter when they fundamentally do, and we see it time and time again, but it often gets completely drowned out.
And for our next question, Sri, this one's directed to you, which is, how is food production in the United States connected to climate change?
I love this question. Short story. Before I directed our climate campaign here at Corporate Accountability, I worked for many years on our food campaign. So this question is very near and dear to my heart. And I think the core of it is it's intricately connected, right? The choices about what we do with our farmland, the kind of farming techniques that we use have immense consequences for greenhouse gas emissions and our climate. And we see right now in the US that we have a food system that is overwhelmingly dependent on chemical fertilizers and industrialized food productions that involve inputs from fossil fuels and petrochemicals. And we see the devastating impact that has on our health, on the environment, and on the planet. So, I think one of the things that we really need to do is we need to ensure that we're incorporating sustainable regenerative food and agriculture policy, both here in the US in terms of what the US supports through its foreign policy around the world. Certainly not allowing for more and more Monsantos and Bayers to privatize agricultural systems and food production globally. And at the same time, we really do need to ensure that we are providing ways to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions and ensure that the ways in which a lot of food corporations who are also seeing both linked to deforestation, linked to increased meat production, et cetera, are really trying to greenwash their own images in the same way that the fossil fuel companies have been doing, that we're holding their feet to the fire and ensuring that, as we will probably see or have been seeing some of them come out with net zero commitments, that we're looking at how are they actually reducing real emissions, and how are they not simply putting these out as greenwashing schemes, draw attention away from their massive contribution through both the inputs and connection to the petrochemical industry, as well as through driving deforestation and a loss of biodiversity, whether we look at the Amazon fires that have been happening in South America or around the world in Indonesia, that we don't let these corporations off the hook for the devastation, frankly, that they've been driving.
And we have just a few minutes left, a couple minutes, but I want to ask you all, and if I could ask if you guys try and keep it concise, but what do you say to someone who says that they are cynical and they're depressed about this moment and they don't think that there is really a path forward, especially when it comes to helping the climate? what do you say to someone who just says, I'm so cynical that I frankly want to give up? And Rachel, I'll start with you.
Well, I would say that we don't have the right to give up. There's too much at stake. You may be having a bad day on any given day. We've all had those days. It's okay to share the burden. You don't have to carry it every single day. But we as a movement, we can't give up. That's not an option. And we're in this because of what's at stake. It is the future of our planet, the future of generations to come, and it is the future of people right here and now in our own country and around the world. So with all of that at stake, as a movement, we can never say concede. Every fraction of a degree we can avoid is hugely consequential. So we have to throw everything at it right now, and we will do it. I'm very firmly convinced of this. We will do it, but it's one of those things where you have to have the vision and then just be laser focused on making it real and know that you're not alone. That's the first thing. You don't have to carry it yourself. There's a very big movement here.
Michel, what do you say to that person?
First, I would tell them to go read some articles from Mary Hegler and from Black women that are leading the way on the words that move my heart. And that's definitely one place to start. The second thing that I would say is that you are intentionally being manipulated to feel apathetic. Everything that you feel has been almost governed to you from the system that has been built, from the participation you have in the political system, to your ability to like think that voting matters, to the community solidarity that you're participating in. All of it has been set up to make you feel like you don't matter, so that you step out and step away from the political power that you do have. And then the final thing that I would say is that, you know, I understand that feeling. I've definitely been there in moments. We are all there in moments, but to stay in that moment is a true disservice to the world that has ended for so many people and so many populations 1,000 times over. How many communities had their whole world end under slavery and the transatlantic slave trade? How many communities have had their world ended under volcanic eruptions and, you know, the removal of democracy, the transition of entire governments? How many times has that happened, and why are you so scorned by the potential of future that you don't want to step into this moment? And I think that that is just a powerful moment that we're in. The world is going to end at some point. I understand that that sounds crazy, but the world has ended for people many times, and it's going to look different depending on the action we take right now. So every person that we lose matters. And I really honestly believe that. And every step that we take to save every individual life matters. So what are you going to do in this moment?
And Sririam, I'll leave it to you. Quick closing thought. What do you say to that cynical person?
You know, I think there's a few things that stick with me. One, resilience is a practice. Hope is a practice. We've got to exercise those muscles to stay here for the movement and for each other, because we're not going to get there alone. And then to end, I'll really just bring forward the words of none other than Nelson Mandela. It is always impossible until it is done. And it always feels like the darkest hour comes right before the dawn and when we win. So it is possible. Stay in it. We need you.
But on that note, thank you very much to our panelists for joining us. Thank you to the audience for staying with us during this. I hope that you enjoyed it. And thank you to WGBH in Suffolk for welcoming me back. It's great to be back with you guys. I'm going to toss it back over to Christina now, but have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Arjun, and thanks to all of our great panelists. I think you made it very clear that the movement is for climate change, for climate justice, for environment, is strong and vibrant and passionate. I don't think you answered the question of whether or not the Biden administration is going to meet your expectations and work with you. So that is something that we should all stay tuned to watch, to see, and to monitor. So I will be watching. I know your movement and your organizations will be watching, and maybe you'll come back and talk to us. To the audience and to our students, thanks for hanging in, asking all of those great questions. And we would love to see you back at our next episode, which will take place on March 18th. And we'll examine yet another item on Biden's substantial plate of competing emergencies. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.